Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be looking at the historical understanding of argumentation, with a focus on a particular type of argument called a syllogism, as described by the ancient Greeks. In your textbook, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies, which I have linked in the description box below, you read a little of the history, how increased democracy made it so that power was directly correlated with your ability to give persuasive arguments to your fellow citizens, which led to a much more intensive study of language, though others pursued it for knowledge rather than power. One of the ancient figures mentioned in your textbook is Aristotle, whose picture you see here, and who stands at the root of so many sciences today. His mania for collecting and classifying information was invaluable for later generations. His writings cover many subjects including physics, poetry, theater, music, logic, rhetoric, linguistics, politics, government, ethics, biology, zoology, and more. Aristotle's writings were the first to create a comprehensive system of Western philosophy, encompassing ethics, aesthetics, logic, science, politics, and metaphysics. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, Aristotle was the first genuine scientist in history. Every scientist is in his debt, end quote. Likely because he introduced the fundamental notion that nature is composed of things that change, and that studying such changes can provide useful knowledge of underlying constants. He was way ahead of his time. In the zoological sciences, some of his observations were confirmed to be accurate only in the 19th century, such as elements of his classifications of living things. More relevant to our course is that his works also contain the earliest known formal study of logic, which continued to exert strong influence for millennia after Aristotle's death in 322 BCE. Among Aristotle's many contributions to the art of thinking, speaking, and argumentation was a logical pattern of thinking called a syllogism, which is the basis for deductive reasoning. Many arguments can be reduced to this type of structure, which makes it easy to evaluate the logic involved and decide whether the argument is valid or invalid, though mere validity isn't the same as actual truth, as we will see. Basically, a syllogism consists of three parts: a major premise, which is usually a more general statement, a minor premise, which is usually a more specific statement, and a conclusion. Premise is just a fancy name for a reason, so you have two reasons and a conclusion. Each of the two premises shares a middle term or an identical part that drops out of the conclusion. Let's take a look at an example so you can see it in action. As I said, all syllogisms are composed of three statements, and you will see that form demonstrated here, where we will examine the classic example of a syllogism, which was actually written by Aristotle himself. This syllogism is more than 2,000 years old. Syllogisms are the main form of deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning begins with an accepted generalization, an already formulated or established general truth which is used to discover a new logical relationship. Basically, deductive reasoning starts from what is known or accepted as true. In a way, it's merely rearranging information to come to a new understanding or to prove something, as you'll see in the following example. So then, a syllogism begins with a major premise, which is a more general accepted truth. In this case, the major premise is that all men are mortal. You can see how this is a more blanket kind of a statement, making a claim about something that is true of all men in general, a whole category at once. This is also an accepted truth that the listener will have no problems accepting as true. The second part of a syllogism is a minor premise, which is more specific and focused. In this case, the minor premise is that the ancient philosopher Socrates, who taught Aristotle's teacher Plato, is a man. Clearly, saying that a certain individual is part of a larger group is more specific than saying that something is true of that entire group, and indeed, this is the specific premise. As I mentioned previously, the two premises will share a middle term or a shared idea or concept. In this example, both premises refer to the idea of men or humans as a group, so this is the middle term. Finally, we have the conclusion, which will rearrange the information so that the middle term drops out. In this case, that makes the conclusion that Socrates must be mortal. Now that you've had a chance to see how syllogisms work, let's talk a little bit more about them. Deductive reasoning has a few advantages that make it attractive, with the biggest one being that the conclusion follows necessarily from the reasons or premises. If they are true, the conclusion must be true with 100% certainty. It would be impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. You can see this with the previous example. If it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, then Socrates has to be mortal. The conclusion is logically inescapable. People love certainty, and thus syllogisms have a certain attractiveness due to being certain. However, deduction also has a downside in that you are only rearranging known or agreed upon information. Nothing new is being added or discovered. However, Aristotle did his best to alleviate this problem as much as possible by giving arguments that could be used in nearly any situation. It can often be easy to get an audience to agree with a reasonable seeming statement that you can then build an argument on. For example, he says that one can argue that a greater number of things is better than a smaller number. In other words, he's saying that it's better to have more of something than to have less. That seems logical, right? We'd all love to have more money, more time, more of the things we love. He says then that you can argue that something common is better than something rare since you will have more of the common thing, and it's better to have more of something. On the other hand, he points out that what is rarer can be better than what is common because it requires more effort to find or produce and thus is intrinsically worth more per unit. That seems reasonable as well. Something rare is better because it's worth more. So then, something extremely common is sunshine. It's literally all around us every day. On the other hand, something that's fairly rare is diamonds. So then, using Aristotle's proposed arguments, you could basically argue either side using syllogisms. You could argue that sunshine is better than diamonds because sunshine makes lots of things like warmth and crops grow, and it's better to have more of something. Or you could argue that diamonds are better than sunshine because they're more difficult to acquire and are therefore worth more. Let's see what the syllogisms for each would look like to see how you can have a valid syllogism arguing opposite sides of an issue. The syllogisms would go like this. What is difficult to acquire is better. Diamonds are more difficult to acquire than sunshine. Therefore, diamonds are better than sunshine. What was the middle term here? Difficult to acquire. Or, on the other side, what creates more goods is better than what creates fewer goods. Sunshine, by growing crops and warming the world, produces more goods than diamonds do. Therefore, sunshine is better than diamonds. What was the middle term? More goods produced. Seeing this, it also makes sense that in actual practice, the entire syllogism is rarely written out completely. A person would say, diamonds are better than sunshine because they are more difficult to acquire, not the somewhat awkward set of sentences on the left. Often, only some parts of a syllogism are explicitly stated, with the audience expected to fill in the rest. This is called an enthymeme, and is what makes syllogistic reasoning such a useful tool. By filling in the missing parts through logical deduction, you can create the complete syllogism, which gives you a way of evaluating the argument. You can apply the rules of deductive logic to determine whether the reasoning is sound or valid. If not, then the entire argument can be discarded or easily refuted. If the structure is valid, that means as long as the premises are true, the conclusion is a matter of certainty. Therefore, to disprove the argument, you would need to disprove one of the premises, and if you decide that the premises are true, you can accept the argument with confidence and defend it with eloquence and unassailable logic. Again, before I move on, I really want to emphasize that syllogisms are useful not because people talk in 3-sentence sets of premises, but because what they're saying can be expressed or rephrased as a syllogism, which you can in turn use to evaluate the validity and the correctness of their argument. Let's pause for a minute before we go on to the types of syllogisms and what makes them valid or invalid constructions by taking a closer look at the concept of validity versus correctness. Validity is about the structure or the format. Does the logical structure work? Correctness is about whether the premises are true, and an argument that is sound is both valid and correct. If a syllogism is set up in a valid way, then if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true with 100% certainty. As we saw earlier, if it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, then there is no getting around the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. It is 100% certain. However, a syllogism can be set up in a valid way and yet still be wrong due to a premise being wrong. For example, if I say that all English teachers are mean, Professor Lukas is an English teacher, therefore Professor Lukas is mean, it is logically valid. If it is true that all English teachers are mean and Professor Lukas is one, then she has to be mean. However, as you hopefully all know, not all English teachers are mean. In fact, hopefully not even most of them are. Therefore, while this argument is valid, it is incorrect. Here's another example where the structure is fine, so it's valid, but the premises are flawed, leaving it incorrect. Every animal that has wings can fly. Penguins have wings. Therefore, penguins can fly. Logically valid, but factually incorrect due to a premise being incorrect. It is actually not true that all animals that have wings can fly. So, being valid logically isn't magic armor against being disproven, but having a logically invalid argument is asking for trouble, since it can be easily disproven. However, it can only be disproven by someone who knows how logic works, which is why it's important and useful to learn, both to strengthen your own arguments as well as for evaluating all the arguments we hear all the time. As citizens of a democracy, it's our responsibility to be good critical thinkers so that we can make the right decisions for our society as well as in our personal lives. Now, there are 3 main syllogism types that we'll be discussing today. Others exist, but these are the most common and will give you a basis for looking at logical arguments. If you'd like to learn more about them, you can take a course or read a book on formal logic. Categorical syllogisms are the most common type of syllogism, and, unsurprisingly, categorical syllogisms put things into categories. They say that all, some, or none of A is B. The validity of these types of syllogisms can be tested with a Venn diagram. Where you place the circles of the diagram depends on the terms being used. Anytime the premise or conclusion says all, the circles should be inside each other. If it says some, they should overlap, and if it says none, the 2 circles should be completely separate. We'll look at several examples to see how this works in this and the next few slides. Let's begin by taking a look at how we would diagram the very first syllogism I mentioned to test whether it's valid. Therefore, we'll be testing a valid categorical syllogism that uses the word all. If you recall, the original syllogism was about men, mortality, and Socrates. Let's take a look at how we would test it using a Venn diagram. All men are mortal. This says all, so the circle for men needs to be inside the circle for mortal to show that every member in the category men also fits into the larger category of mortal. Socrates is a man. This is all as well, so the circle for Socrates needs to be inside the circle for men. Socrates is mortal. This conclusion checks out. When we look at the circles, we can see that since Socrates is a member of all men, and all men are a member of things that are mortal, Socrates is mortal. This, then, is how the Venn diagram would appear for a valid categorical syllogism using all. For the purposes of comparison, let's take a look at how an invalid diagram might look. Let's go through this categorical syllogism the same way that we did the last one. The first premise is that all dogs have 4 legs. This says all, so the circle for dogs needs to be inside the circle for things with 4 legs to show that every member of the category dogs also fits into the larger category of things with 4 legs. The next premise says that all chairs have 4 legs. This also says all, so the circle for chairs needs to be inside the circle for things with 4 legs, but since no other information is given, we want to keep that circle away from our circle for dogs. Here is the diagram that would be created. The circles for dogs and chairs are both inside the circles for things with 4 legs, but are not touching each other. Now, let's look at the conclusion. All dogs are chairs. You can see that this is logically ridiculous, but you can also look at the Venn diagram to see that while both dogs and chairs are in the same category of things that have 4 legs, they're not the same as each other, nor is the dog circle inside the chair circle. Now that we have seen Venn diagrams for valid and invalid categorical syllogisms using all, let's take a look at the next type, ones that use some. Now, remember that for some, the circles will overlap, since some members of one group are part of the other, but not all of them. Let's see how this plays out with a valid categorical syllogism using some. The first line of our syllogism reads that all informative things are useful. This means that the circle for informative things needs to be inside the circle for useful things to show that every member of the category informative things also fits into the larger category of useful things. However, this time I drew it near the edge since I know I will have to do an overlapping circle and I don't want to confuse things. The next premise reads, some websites are not informative. Therefore, we want to put the circle for websites so that it is partially in and partially out of the informative things circle. And now you can see why I put it at the edge, since the premise doesn't say anything about the relationships of websites to being useful. Now the conclusion. Some websites are not useful. Looking at the diagram, we can see that this is a valid conclusion. Now that we've seen a valid categorical syllogism using some, let's look at an invalid one. This time, we'll be looking at an example of an invalid categorical syllogism using the word some. The first premise of our syllogism says that some tigers are orange. Therefore, we want a circle that is partially inside and partially outside of the things that are orange category. The second premise is that some traffic lights are orange, so we'll do the same with another circle partially in and partially out of things that are orange. Now the conclusion. Some tigers are traffic lights. Looking at the diagram makes it clear that we have been given no information that would show that these two categories overlap, even though both of them overlap with a third one. This syllogism makes things seem rather easy because we know that both premises are true and that the conclusion is false, so obviously it has to have an invalid structure. Any syllogism with 2 true premises and a valid structure has to have a correct conclusion. However, when the information or the conclusion isn't as obviously incorrect, this is one of the most common logical errors that people make when categorizing in combinations. Hopefully, these examples are helping you to realize how the Venn diagrams work as a visual representation of the logic, making it easy to see whether it fits together. Also, I want to remind you again that while a fully and formally stated syllogism is rare in today's world, enthymemes, or syllogism logic that leaves parts unstated, usually an unstated general premise, is common. Almost any logical, persuasive, or logical debate piece can have elements of an overall syllogism. For example, take the statement, "I am an American citizen and I have a right to a lawyer." This is really an enthymeme for the syllogism, "All American citizens have a right to a lawyer. I am an American citizen, therefore I have a right to a lawyer." Let's move on to the next example. Here we have an example of how we might draw a diagram for a categorical syllogism using none. Let's take a look. The first premise says, "No evergreens lose their leaves in winter." Therefore, we will draw two circles totally separate from each other, one for evergreens and one for trees that lose their leaves in winter. This shows that none of one group belongs to the other. The second premise says that all maple trees lose their leaves in winter. Therefore, we need to put a circle for maple trees completely inside the circle for trees that lose their leaves in winter. Now, the conclusion is that no maples are evergreens. Looking at the diagram, we can see that if all the information we have been given is correct, then the conclusion has to be true. It is a valid syllogism. Our last example of a diagram for categorical syllogism is for an invalid one using none. Let's take a look at the diagram and the syllogism it's testing. The first premise is that no cats are crows. Therefore, we would draw two separate circles, one for cats and one for crows, to show that they do not have any members in common. The second premise states that some crows are black. Therefore, we want to draw a circle that overlaps crows to represent things that are black. The conclusion, where the middle shared term of crow drops out, is that no cats are black. However, we can see that that hasn't been proven because I was able to draw my diagram in a way that matched all the stated premises but disproves the conclusion. If you can draw the diagram in a way that fits the premises but not the conclusion, it is invalid, even if you could draw it another way that would appear to work. This concludes our look at categorical syllogisms. You'll be happy to know that the procedure for testing the validity of the other two types is much more straightforward. Hypothetical syllogisms are also sometimes known as conditional syllogisms, but we'll be calling them hypothetical, as is most common. They are if-then statements and often come in the form of enthymemes in real life. I have one example here. "It's afternoon, so it's too late to get a ticket," is an enthymeme hiding the syllogism, "If it is afternoon, then it is too late to get a ticket. It is afternoon. It is too late to get a ticket." As another example, "You went out without a jacket, you're going to get sick now," is really a syllogism like, "If you go out without a jacket on, you will get sick. You did go out without a jacket, therefore you will get sick." Basically, what you need to know about hypothetical syllogisms is how to recognize them, which is by the if-then construction, and how to know if they're valid or not. This type of syllogism is valid if the if clause is affirmed. In other words, if what you were saying if about happened, like it being afternoon in the example on this slide. The syllogism is also valid if the then clause is denied. So this example would also have been valid if the second premise had been, "It is not too late to get a ticket," thereby saying that the "then it is too late" didn't come true, and the conclusion was it must not be afternoon. On the other hand, the syllogism is invalid if the if clause is denied. If we had said, "If you go out without a jacket on, you will get sick," You did not go out without a jacket, therefore you will not get sick. That wouldn't work. After all, you could get sick for some other reason. Similarly, if the then clause is affirmed, it isn't valid because you don't have 100% certainty. Again, in the jacket example, I could say, if you go out without a jacket on, you will get sick. You did get sick. Therefore, you went out without a jacket on. However, again, it is an invalid structure because you could have gotten sick another way. It doesn't have the valid, logical structure that gives certain and undeniable truth when the premises are correct. Let's take a look at a couple of examples to see if you can identify whether each is valid or invalid. In other words, if the claims are true, does the conclusion have to be true? Keep in mind the guidelines from this slide. You might want to quickly note down what makes this type valid or invalid, as we move on to the next slide and some examples of hypothetical syllogisms. You can also use the guide to determining validity linked in the description box below, which we will examine in more detail later in this video. I encourage you to pause after each syllogism is presented and try to determine for yourself whether the syllogism is valid or not before listening to my explanation of the answer. The first one says, if Ted is working on his philosophy paper, then he will be using his computer. Look, he's using his computer now. That means he's working on his philosophy paper. First, we should determine which is the if and which is the then. In this case, the if is Ted working on his paper, and the then is using the computer. The then is affirmed, but that means it's invalid. After all, he might be scrolling through Facebook or watching YouTube on his computer. He isn't necessarily working on that paper. The next example reads, if I see one more person saying, I'm doing good instead of I'm doing well, then I'm gonna scream. I just asked Sarah how she's doing and she said, I'm doing good. I will therefore scream. In this case, what is the if? The then. The if is someone saying they are doing good, and the then is screaming. In this case, the if was affirmed. I did hear someone say, I'm doing good, so the syllogism is valid, and there's clearly some screaming in the near future. The third example reads, if Kim adds chili peppers to her brownies, they won't win first prize. She didn't add chili pepper to the brownies. She will therefore win first prize. Again, some logical thought can unravel this. Just because she'll automatically lose for having chili pepper brownies doesn't mean she'll automatically win if she doesn't. But the syllogism evaluation lets you figure it out mathematically. The if is adding chili pepper, and the then is not winning first prize. The if was denied, and that means it's invalid. Her brownies might not be the best, even if they aren't inedible. The next example reads, Mrs. Chavez will yell at Jose again if he got another speeding ticket. Listen, Mrs. Chavez is screaming at Jose at the top of her lungs. He obviously got another speeding ticket. Again, logic will tell you that she could be yelling at him for any number of things besides a speeding ticket, so you know this isn't valid. But we can also determine this using the syllogism tests, which works even when the answer isn't so obvious. Here, the if is Jose getting a speeding ticket, with the then being his mom yelling at him for it. The then is affirmed since his mom is yelling, which the chart tells you means this syllogism is invalid. The conclusion is not certain to be true. She might be yelling at him about a ticket, but she might be yelling at him for something else, like coming home late and waking her up, or breaking a household rule. The next example says that the vegetables will be free from harmful pests if they have been fumigated. The inspector confirms that they are indeed free from harmful pests, so we can conclude that these vegetables have been fumigated. Here, the if is being fumigated, and the then is being free of pests. The then is affirmed, which we know means the syllogism is invalid. Just because fumigation results in no pests doesn't mean that it has to be fumigated to not have any pests. Other methods can work as well. The final example says that if Cindy went to the beach, she got sunburned. But she didn't get sunburned, so she must not have gone to the beach. In this case, the if is going to the beach, and the then is getting sunburned. The then was denied, so the syllogism is valid. You can think about it logically, too. If she gets sunburned every time she goes and she's not sunburned, then she obviously can't have gone. Arguing about whether it's true that she gets sunburned every time would be challenging the correctness or the accuracy of the premises. In this lecture, I'm only teaching you how to evaluate the validity or the structure. Now that you've had a chance to practice evaluating categorical and hypothetical syllogisms, let's move on to the last type that we'll be discussing today. Disjunctive syllogisms are alternatives expressed in either-or statements. Imagine two friends planning their dinner. Either will have spaghetti or order takeout pizza. Then the next premise proceeds to make a statement about one of the terms, and the syllogism is completed by drawing a conclusion about the other term. We can't afford to get takeout pizza again, so we will have spaghetti. This is a sound argument. They said they would do one or the other, and they've eliminated one of the options, so they had to do the other one. So denying either one automatically means that we accept the other one. But what if we accept one of the alternatives instead of denying one? If someone proposed either going to the movies or attending a party, when they say, we went to the movie, so we can't go to the party, can we be sure of that? Maybe. Either or has two meanings. One is exclusive, which means that we can have or do A or B, but not both. The other type is inclusive, which means that we can have or do A or B, or both A and B. For example, you might be able to see a movie and go to a party by going either before or after the movie. But sometimes we can't do both options. I could say, on Monday, either I'll drive to work or walk. If I walk, I won't drive. If I drive, I won't walk. You have to decide whether or being used is inclusive or exclusive to decide whether accepting one option gives us firm information about the other one. If we deny one, we affirm the other, so we have a valid syllogism no matter what. But if we affirm one, whether we can draw a conclusion about the other depends on whether it's inclusive or exclusive. Often, whether something is inclusive or exclusive must be determined by context and by using your critical thinking skills. Now, again, keep in mind what makes this type of syllogism valid or invalid as we go to the next slide to look at some examples. Again, you might want to make a small note to remind you as we go through the examples on the following slide, and I encourage you once more to pause as each example is presented and to try to determine for yourself if it is valid or not before listening to my explanations. Let's dive right in. The first example of a disjunctive syllogism says that either you are allergic to something in this dish or an ingredient went bad. You don't have any allergies, so an ingredient must have gone bad. With this type of syllogism, the first thing we want to do is decide if one option is denied or if one is affirmed. If one is denied, we know the syllogism is valid without having to think any more about it. But if one is affirmed, we need to take further steps. In this case, the syllogism says that you don't have any allergies, so one is denied. Therefore, we know this is valid. The next example says that either Dad will like the tie we got him or he won't. He likes it, so he doesn't dislike it. In this case, one of the options is affirmed, so we have to do further work to decide if it's valid or not. We have to decide if it is inclusive, both could be true at the same time, or exclusive, where both is not possible. Looking at what it says, it's pretty easy to determine that liking and not liking are exclusive. It has to be one or the other, not both. Looking at the rules, we can see that if one of the options is affirmed and it's exclusive, we can know for sure that the other didn't happen, and therefore this syllogism is valid. Moving on, the next example reads, either I will do my homework or I will fail the course. I did my homework, so I won't fail. Now, again, the first step is to decide if an option is being affirmed or denied. We can see here that one is affirmed. You did do your homework. So we have to take the next step to decide if both of the options can happen at the same time. Is it possible to do your homework and still fail a class? Unfortunately, it is very possible. Therefore, this is inclusive, and that means it's invalid. You can see it doesn't work just using your critical thinking skills as well. Just because you'll automatically fail for not doing your homework doesn't mean that you'll automatically pass for doing it. The next example says that either the witness is telling the truth or Johnson is innocent. But the witness is lying, so Johnson is innocent. Again, the first step is to decide if an option is being affirmed or denied. The options were telling the truth and Johnson is innocent. And we were told that the witness is lying, which means that telling the truth, the first option, is being denied. If something is being denied, we don't even need to do anything else. We automatically know that it will be valid. And now, on to our final example. This one says that the Soviets can be receiving secret information about our new fighter either by satellite photography, telephone eavesdropping, computer signal interception, or an agent inside the fighter plant. And look, here's a report from our Moscow operatives. Conclusive proof that the Soviets are gathering data about our fighter from satellite photos. Well, I'm glad we can be sure there's no eavesdropping or inside agent problem. Now, this one is a bit more advanced example since it involves 4 options. However, it works in the exact same way. First, we'll determine whether one is being affirmed or denied. We can see that one is affirmed. They are getting secret information from satellite photos. So that means we'll have to take the next step and decide if the options are inclusive or exclusive. So, take a second and think about, is it possible to gather information from more than one of these sources at once? Like getting information from a secret agent and satellite photos? Obviously, it is possible. So, this is an inclusive syllogism, meaning that it is invalid. We know we can't count on the conclusion being true because the structure does not hold up. Now that you're somewhat familiar with the methods for testing each of these types, let's take a look at the chart that I promised you. You can see here that I have included a quick reference chart so that you can easily tell if a syllogism is valid or not by first determining the type, categorical, hypothetical, or disjunctive, and then following the directions. I have also linked to a PDF version of this page in the description box below, where you can download and save or print this particular page in a clearer format. As we finish up, I would like to review a few last things about syllogisms. One is to keep in mind the requirements for validity for any type of syllogism. First, it has to have exactly 3 terms, and they have to share a middle term. If I say, everyone in this room takes English 1A, Janet is in this room, Mark takes English 1A. That is not a syllogism, and we cannot be assured that our conclusion is correct. Secondly, if a term is being used to mean more than one thing, the syllogism isn't valid. You can use synonyms, but not change meaning. For example, look at the following syllogism. Power corrupts. Knowledge is power. Therefore, knowledge corrupts. Here, the problem is that the word power is being used two different ways. Once to mean the possession of control or command over people, and once meaning the ability to understand, control, or affect things. Another example of a word being used with multiple meanings is a syllogism like, people should treat each other with respect. I treat you with respect. Therefore, you should treat me with respect. In this case, often the person uses respect the first two times to mean treated like a person with needs and feelings that matter, whereas the respect that they are demanding in return means something more like treated like a person with authority over you. If the term does not have the same meaning every time it's used, the syllogism is invalid and you cannot rely on the conclusion to be true. In addition, knowing the language of syllogisms helps you more clearly see why. You will now have a much more logical objection when someone wants you to treat them like an authority just because they are treating you like a person. One final example is often known as politicians' logic, and it says, something must be done. This is something. Therefore, we must do it. In this case, the obvious mistake is assuming the policy to be enacted is the right one. The something in the first premise means something that will solve the problem, and the something in the second premise means anything at all. So then, term meanings must remain constant. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, the middle term must be shared or it doesn't work. Remember, the point of all this is that syllogisms underlie much of the logic around us, and your understanding of them can help you spot both logical weakness and logical strength. Enthymemes are all around us. For example, if someone says, Senator Smith is a politician, so he could be corrupt, what they are really basing that on is a categorical syllogism. Some politicians are corrupt. Senator Smith is a politician. Senator Smith could be corrupt. Unfortunately for Senator Smith, this is a valid and correct syllogism, a sound argument. Another reason why it's worth spending time learning about syllogisms is that they are an indisputable way to show logical weakness or to affirm truth. Remember, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true 100%. There's no way around it. This can certainly be very useful when you're arguing, and being able to recognize when the certainty is being invoked but isn't warranted can be even more useful. I hope that the discussions and information contained in this video and the textbook chapter were useful and helpful. Thank you for joining me on this brief foray into ancient understandings of logic and argument and how those concepts can be useful to us today.